They refused him water, so he gave his last drop away, and by sunrise, an army came for him. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you believe justice doesn't always ride with a gun, stay with this story. Now, back to the dust. The first thing Caleb Whitaker noticed wasn't the sound. It was the stillness. 300 horses should have shaken the earth like thunder across open land. But this was quiet. Too quiet. They stood in a wide circle around his ranch, dark shapes against the pale morning light, their silhouettes cutting through the rising heat like shadows that refused to move. Caleb's fingers hung loose by his side, too dry to even curl. The empty canteen knocked softly against his leg with each shallow breath. That hollow sound, it felt louder than anything else. 12 hours earlier, that canteen had meant life. Now, it was just metal and regret. Or maybe not regret. He hadn't decided yet. The sun climbed slowly over the ridge, spilling gold across cracked earth that hadn't seen rain in months. The wind carried dust instead of relief. Somewhere behind him, the warped wood of his fence creaked, as if even the land itself was bracing for what came next. He didn't reach for his rifle. Not because he didn't have one. It leaned against the post just 10 feet away. But something in the way those riders waited told him this wasn't about speed. This wasn't about who fired first. This was something else. Something heavier. Across the circle, one rider shifted. Then another. Not advancing. Not retreating. Just watching. The kind of watching that weighed on a man's chest more than fear ever could. Caleb swallowed, or tried to. His throat burned like dry leather left too long in the sun. He could still feel the last drop of water as it left his lips the night before. Not swallowed. Given. That moment replayed without mercy. The man on the ground. The labored breath. The eyes, dark, steady, refusing to close even as life slipped thin as thread. Caleb had known what that meant. Out here, water wasn't kindness. It was survival. It was time. It was choice. And he had made his. Now the consequence stood in front of him, 300 strong. The town had gathered by the ridge, keeping their distance but close enough to see. He could feel their eyes on his back. Waiting. Wondering if this was the price for crossing a line men didn't speak about but always understood. A breeze rolled through, lifting the edge of his coat just enough to remind him how light it felt without weight in his pockets. No water. No advantage. Just a man standing on borrowed ground. Then, movement. One rider stepped forward. Slow. Deliberate. The kind of movement that didn't ask permission and didn't need it. Caleb's breath caught, not from fear, but from something deeper. Recognition. The figure dismounted before reaching him. Boots met the dust with a soft, final sound. The distance between them closed one step at a time. And when the man lifted his head, the morning light caught something Caleb hadn't seen the night before. Not weakness. Not desperation. Authority. The kind that didn't come from a weapon, but from being followed. Caleb didn't move. Couldn't. Because in that moment, he realized something that made the silence heavier than any threat. This wasn't about what he had taken. It was about what he had given. And out here, that meant everything. The man stopped 10 feet from Caleb and did not speak right away, and somehow that silence carried more weight than any threat ever could, because it was not empty, it was full of judgment, of memory, of something Caleb could not yet understand, and the wind shifted just enough to carry the faint scent of sage and horse sweat across the dry air, mixing with dust that clung to skin like a second layer, and Caleb felt it settle on his face, his lips cracking further as he tried again to swallow. Nothing, his tongue heavy, his thoughts slow from the long night without water, but his eyes stayed locked on the man before him, because now he could see clearly what he had missed in the dark, the details that mattered, the beads woven into the man's hair, the worn leather that spoke of years rather than days, the posture of someone who did not need to prove anything to anyone, and behind him, the 300 riders remained. Perfectly still, not restless, not eager, just waiting, as if they had all agreed on something long before arriving here, and Caleb's chest tightened not from fear, but from the realization that whatever this was, it had already been decided, somewhere far beyond his understanding, and the man finally lifted his hand, slow and steady, not toward a weapon, but toward his own chest, fingers brushing lightly against a symbol that hung there, something carved from stone and wrapped in silver. Catching the morning light in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and Caleb felt a flicker of recognition, not from memory, but from instinct, the kind that told a man when he stood before someone important, someone whose choices carried weight far beyond a single life, and the man's eyes, dark and unwavering, studied Caleb not with anger, not even with suspicion, but with something far more unsettling, consideration, as if measuring not what Caleb had done, but why he had done it, and that question hung in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable, stretching the silence longer, heavier, until even the distant figures of the townspeople seemed to fade into the background, their whispers swallowed by the stillness, and Caleb became aware of the empty canteen at his side again, the way it tapped lightly against his leg, a dull, hollow reminder of the choice that had brought him here. And he could feel the dryness in his bones now, deeper than thirst, a kind of emptiness. That came from giving something you could not afford to lose, and still, he did not move, did not reach for the rifle behind him, did not step back, because somewhere in that long, quiet stare, he understood that none of those things would matter, not here, not now, and the man took one more step forward, close enough that the dust shifted under his boots, close enough that Caleb could see the faint lines of exhaustion still lingering beneath the strength, the echo of the man who had lain in the sand just hours before, barely holding on, and it struck Caleb then, clear and sharp, that this was the same man, not just alive, but restored in a way that did not make sense, and the realization settled over him like the heat rising from the ground, slow and undeniable, that whatever had happened in the night, whatever forces had moved while he struggled to breathe through the darkness, they had led to this moment, this circle of riders, this silence, this man standing before him with eyes that held both memory and decision, and when the man finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying across the space between them without effort. It was not loud, but it did not need to be, because every rider heard it, every witness felt it, and the words came not as accusation, not as thanks, but as a question that cut deeper than either, asking not what Caleb had done, but what kind of man chooses to give life away when he has nothing left for himself. Caleb did not answer right away, and the silence that followed the question felt different from the one before, heavier in a way that pressed against his ribs like the heat rising off the ground, because this was no longer about what might happen next, it was about who he was when it mattered, and he searched for words but found none that felt strong enough to stand in front of 300 riders, none that could carry the weight of a choice made in the dark with no witness but the wind, so he lifted his head just slightly, enough to meet the man's gaze without defiance, without surrender, and when he finally spoke, his voice came rough, dry, but steady, shaped by dust and truth rather than fear. He said that a man dying of thirst is not an enemy, he is just a man, and the words hung there, simple, almost too simple for something that had brought an entire force to his doorstep, and yet they did not fall apart. They did not weaken under the weight of the moment, instead they seemed to settle into the space between them like something that belonged there, and the man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but something in his eyes shifted, not softening, not hardening, but focusing, as if the answer had unlocked something he had been waiting to hear, and behind him, the riders remained still, but the stillness itself began to change, not breaking, just breathing in a different rhythm, subtle, like a field before a storm chooses whether to rise or rest, and Caleb felt it even if he could not explain it, a shift in the air, a movement that did not involve motion, and his grip tightened slightly at his side, not on a weapon, but on nothing at all, because there was nothing left to hold on to, no water, no advantage, no second chance to choose differently, only the echo of that single decision, and the man took another step closer, now within arm's reach, close enough that Caleb could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the kind that came from years of looking at things most men turned away from, and the dust on his boots, the same dust that covered Caleb's own land, as if for a moment there was no difference between them except the path that had brought them here, and the man lowered his gaze briefly to the empty canteen, then back to Caleb's face, and that small movement carried meaning, recognition of cost, of sacrifice, of something given without expectation of return, and when he spoke again, his voice remained calm, but now it carried something more, not authority alone, but decision. He said that water is life where the earth forgets rain, and Caleb knew that already, had known it every day he woke to cracked soil and silent skies, but hearing it spoken like that made it feel larger, older, like a truth that did not belong to any one man, and the man continued, saying that giving life is not a small act. Not here, not anywhere, and for the first time, Caleb noticed movement behind him, not from the riders, but from the land itself, faint at first, a sound beneath the surface, like something shifting deep underground, something that had been waiting longer than any of them, and he frowned slightly, unsure if it was real or just the echo of a long night without water, but the man did not look surprised, did not turn, as if he had expected it, as if this moment was not the end of something, but the beginning, and Caleb stood there, caught between exhaustion and awareness, realizing that whatever came next would not be shaped by fear or force, but by something far more unsettling, the quiet weight of being seen exactly as he was, and judged. Not for what he had, but for what he chose to give when he had nothing left. The sound beneath the ground grew clearer, no longer something imagined or mistaken for wind, but a low, steady shift that moved through the soil like a breath held too long finally being released, and Caleb felt it through the soles of his boots, a faint trembling that did not threaten, did not warn, but simply existed, patient and certain, and he glanced down for just a second, long enough to question what kind of land he had been standing on all these years without truly knowing it, before lifting his eyes again to the man in front of him, because whatever this was, it had something to do with him, with that question still hanging in the air, with that answer Caleb had given without thinking he would ever need to defend it, and the man turned his head slightly, not toward the riders, not toward the town watching from a distance, but toward the open stretch of dry earth just beyond the fence line, and with a single, almost effortless motion, he raised his hand and gave a small signal, nothing dramatic, nothing forceful, just a gesture that carried quiet authority, and that was when the first rider moved, then another, then several more, not rushing, not charging, but stepping forward with purpose, dismounting one by one, their boots meeting the dust with soft, measured sounds that echoed in the stillness like the ticking of something long set in motion, and from their saddles they pulled tools, not weapons, simple tools worn smooth by use, and Caleb watched. Confusion cutting through his exhaustion as he realized they were not preparing for a fight, they were preparing for work, and the riders spread out across his land with careful spacing, as if each of them already knew exactly where to go, exactly where to stand, and they began to dig, slow at first, then with rhythm, the sound of metal meeting dry soil rising into the morning air, steady and deliberate, and Caleb stared, trying to make sense of it, because this was not how men came to settle a score, this was not how a wrong was answered, and yet there it was, 300 men working in silence on land that was not theirs, not taking, not tearing, but uncovering something hidden beneath years of dust and neglect, and the townspeople on the ridge shifted, their murmurs growing louder, confusion replacing the expectation they had carried here, because they had come to witness a different kind of ending, one that now seemed to be slipping away from them, and Caleb took a slow step forward, not toward the riders, but toward the man who had not moved, who stood watching the work with the same calm presence he had shown since the beginning, and Caleb's voice came again, quieter this time, not from fear, but from the weight of not understanding, asking what they were doing, and the man did not answer right away, letting the sound of digging fill the space instead, letting Caleb listen, really listen, to what was happening on his own land, before finally speaking in that same steady tone, saying that the earth remembers where life once moved, even when men forget, and Caleb felt those words settle deep, because he had spent years looking at this land as empty, as stubborn, as something that refused to give, and now he watched as it responded to hands that seemed to know it better than he ever had, and the digging grew deeper, the rhythm stronger, until suddenly one of the men stopped, lifting his tool and stepping back, and for a moment everything paused again, the kind of pause that comes just before something changes, and then it came. A sound unlike the dry scrape of dirt, a softer sound, a breaking, followed by a darkening of the soil, and Caleb's breath caught as he saw it, not fully yet, but enough to know, enough to feel the shift in his chest, because where there had been nothing, something had begun to rise, something that did not belong to dust or drought, something that had been waiting all along, just beneath the surface. The dark patch in the soil spread slowly at first, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, but Caleb was, his eyes fixed on that single spot as if the entire world had narrowed down to that one impossible change, and then the ground gave a soft sigh, a quiet release, and something deeper pushed upward, not with force, not with violence, but with certainty, and the color shifted from dry pale dust to something richer, darker, alive in a way the land had not been for years, and one of the men stepped back, lowering his tool, not in surprise but in recognition, as if he had seen this before, as if he had known it would happen at exactly this place and no other, and Caleb took another step forward without realizing it, drawn by something stronger than curiosity, something that reached past exhaustion and into a place he had almost forgotten existed, hope, fragile and unfamiliar, and then it came, not as a burst, not as a flood, but as a quiet emergence, a thin line of water seeping through the broken earth, catching the light in a way that made it look almost unreal, like a trick of the sun, and Caleb blinked hard, once, twice, trying to steady his vision, but the line did not disappear, it grew, slowly widening, gathering strength as more of it followed, rising from beneath the ground with a patience that spoke of time measured in years rather than moments, and the men did not cheer, did not react with excitement, they simply stepped back, giving the earth space to finish what it had started, and the sound changed, no longer the dry scrape of tools, but a soft, steady trickle that carried across the open land like a memory returning, and Caleb felt something loosen in his chest, something tight and brittle beginning to give way, and behind him, the murmurs from the ridge fell into silence, because even from that distance, they could see it now, the shimmer of water where there had been none, the kind of sight that did not need explanation, the kind that forced men to reconsider what they thought they understood, and Caleb dropped to one knee without thinking, his hand pressing into the damp soil, fingers trembling as they sank into something cool for the first time in months, and when he lifted his hand, the water clung to his skin, real, undeniable, and for a moment he did not drink, did not move. He just stared at it, as if trying to understand how something so simple could feel so heavy, and the man stepped beside him, close enough that Caleb could hear his breath, steady and calm, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that same quiet authority, but now it held something else, something closer to acknowledgement. He said that the land gives back when it is treated with respect, when life is returned instead of taken, and Caleb let out a slow breath he did not know he had been holding, his shoulders lowering as the meaning settled in, because this was not a gift handed freely, not something given without reason, it was a response, a balance, a reflection of a choice made when no one was watching, and the water continued to rise, stronger now, enough to form a small stream that cut through the dust, tracing a path that seemed to remember where it once flowed long before Caleb ever set foot on this land, and the riders stood in silence around it, not claiming it, not guarding it, simply bearing witness, and Caleb finally brought his hand to his lips, the water cool against cracked skin, and as he drank, slowly, carefully, he understood that this moment was not the end of something, but the beginning of a story the land had been waiting to tell all along. The water did not rush or roar, it settled into its place with a quiet certainty, carving a narrow path through the dust as if it had always belonged there, and Caleb remained on one knee longer than he realized, his hands still wet, his breath slower now, steadier, as the sharp edge of thirst began to loosen its grip on him, and when he finally looked up, the world around him felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had, because something inside him had shifted in a way that no amount of rain ever could, and the man beside him watched without interruption, giving him the space to understand what had just been given, and more importantly, why, and behind them, the riders began to move again, but not in the way Caleb had expected when he first saw them at dawn. There was no urgency, no command shouted across the land, just quiet coordination, men stepping into place, adjusting the flow of the water with simple tools, guiding it along the natural slope as if they were following a path already written beneath the surface, and Caleb pushed himself slowly to his feet, his legs unsteady not from weakness alone, but from the weight of what he was witnessing, because this was no accident, no sudden miracle dropped from the sky, this was knowledge, passed down, remembered, respected, something he had never been taught, something his people had long stopped listening for, and he turned toward the man again, his voice still rough but clearer now, asking how they knew, how they found water where he had seen only dry earth for years. And the man met his gaze with the same calm expression. Then glanced down at the stream cutting through the land, and said that water does not disappear, it hides, waiting for those who understand how to listen, and Caleb let those words settle, feeling their truth more than understanding it, because he had spent years trying to force this land to give, digging where it looked promising, trusting maps and guesses and hope that never held, but these men had not guessed, they had known, not from chance, but from something deeper, something tied to the land itself, and the thought stayed with him as he watched them work, as he watched the stream widen just enough to carry itself forward, and then he noticed something else, something he had missed in the shock of it all. None of them were taking anything, not filling canteens, not claiming the water for themselves, they were shaping it, leaving it, ensuring it would remain, and that realization pressed against him in a different way, because it meant this was not about repayment alone, it was about something larger, something that extended beyond a single act, and the man stepped forward slightly, his gaze moving across the land Caleb had called his own, then back to him, and said that a man who gives life without asking for return becomes part of the land he stands on, and Caleb felt the weight of that sentence settle deep, heavier than any threat he had feared, because it carried responsibility, not just gratitude, and he looked down at the water again, at the way it moved with quiet purpose, and understood that this was not something he could waste, not something he could take for granted, and behind him, the townspeople remained where they were, silent now, watching a story unfold that none of them had expected, and the riders began to step back, one by one, their work done, their presence no longer pressing but receding like a tide that had come only to leave something behind, and Caleb stood there, alone again in a way that felt entirely different from before, because now the land beneath his feet was no longer empty, and neither was he. The riders did not leave all at once, and that was the part Caleb noticed most, not a retreat, not an ending, but a gradual fading, like a presence that had never meant to stay longer than necessary, and one by one they mounted their horses with the same quiet precision they had shown when they arrived, no wasted movement, no unnecessary sound, just purpose carried out and completed, and the circle that had once felt like a wall around his land slowly opened, not broken, but released, and the space between them widened until the horizon could breathe again, and Caleb stood there watching, his hands still damp, his boots sinking slightly into soil that had already begun to change, softer now, darker in patches where the water traced its path, and he realized something that settled deep in his chest. They had not come to surround him, they had come to surround something else, something he had not seen until now. And as the last few riders turned their horses toward the open plains, the man who had stood before him remained, unmoving for a moment longer, as if making sure Caleb understood what had been left behind, and Caleb found himself speaking again, not out of fear, not out of confusion, but because there was something he needed to know, something that had grown larger with each passing second. He asked why, not why they had come, but why they had chosen him, a man with nothing, a man most people would pass without a second glance, and the question lingered in the air, carried lightly by the morning breeze, and the man considered it, not dismissing it, not answering too quickly, and when he finally spoke, his voice held that same steady tone, but now there was something quieter beneath it, something that felt closer to truth than explanation. He said that a man is not measured by what he keeps, but by what he gives when no one is watching, and Caleb let that settle, because it was not praise, it was not a reward, it was a recognition of something that had already happened, something that could not be undone or taken back, and the man continued, saying that many men pass through this land, some take from it, some fight it, some abandon it, but very few listen to it, and even fewer give back to it without expecting something in return. And Caleb looked down at the stream again, at the way it moved steadily now, no longer uncertain, and he understood that this water was not simply found, it had been revealed, brought forward by something more than effort, something tied to the balance the man spoke of, and the silence stretched again, but this time it was not heavy, it was full, filled with understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud, and the man stepped back at last, turning slightly toward his horse. But before he moved away, he reached into a small pouch at his side and pulled out the canteen Caleb had given him, now full, the metal catching the light in a way that made it seem almost new, and he held it out without ceremony, and Caleb hesitated for just a second before taking it, his fingers closing around something that felt familiar and different at the same time, and the man gave a small nod, not as a gesture of gratitude, but of acknowledgement. And then he mounted his horse in one smooth motion, joining the others who had already begun their slow departure, and as they rode away, the dust rose behind them, not in a storm, but in a quiet trail that faded as quickly as it appeared, leaving Caleb alone once more on his land, except now it was not the same land, and he was not the same man, and as the sound of hooves disappeared into the distance, replaced by the soft, steady flow of water, Caleb stood there in the growing light, holding the canteen, watching the stream, and understanding, perhaps for the first time, that what had been given to him was not just water, but a chance to become the kind of man the land itself would remember. The dust settled long before the silence did, and Caleb stood there with the canteen still in his hand, listening to the last echo of hooves fade into the distance until there was nothing left but wind and water, a sound he had not heard on this land in years, steady, patient, almost like a voice that had finally been given a chance to speak again, and he turned slowly, taking in the shape of his ranch as if seeing it for the first time, the fence posts worn but standing, the barn leaning but holding, the ground no longer just dry and stubborn but marked now by a thin line of movement, a path carved by something alive, and he walked toward it without hurry, each step measured, as if he understood that rushing this moment would somehow break it, and when he reached the edge of the stream, he crouched again, not out of desperation this time, but out of respect, his fingers brushing the surface lightly, watching the ripples spread and return, and he noticed how clear it was, not clouded, not weak, but clean in a way that spoke of something deeper than rain, and behind him, the town had not yet left, though their voices had gone quiet, replaced by a kind of stillness that came when people realized they had witnessed something they could not easily explain, and Caleb could feel their eyes on him again, but it did not weigh on him the same way it once had, because whatever they thought no longer defined what stood here now, and he rose slowly, turning just enough to see them gathered along the ridge, hats pulled low, hands resting at their sides. Uncertain, and for a moment no one moved, as if they were waiting for him to say something, to claim what had happened, to turn it into a story they could understand, but Caleb said nothing, because there was nothing to claim, nothing to explain, only something to live with, and after a while, one man shifted, then another, and the crowd began to thin, not in excitement, not in disappointment, but in quiet acceptance that whatever had taken place here did not belong to them, and as they drifted away, the land seemed to grow larger again, the open space stretching back into itself, and Caleb found himself alone once more, but this time the silence did not press against him, it held him, steady and calm, and he walked back toward the house, pausing at the door just long enough to glance over his shoulder, to see the stream catching the late morning light, a thin ribbon of movement that refused to be ignored, and he stepped inside only to return moments later with a length of old wood and a shovel, tools he had used 100 times before for 100 failed attempts, but now they felt different in his hands, not heavier, not lighter, just, understood, and he began to work along the edge of the water, shaping the path gently, guiding it without forcing it, learning its direction instead of deciding it, and the hours passed without him noticing, the sun climbing high and then beginning its slow descent, and with each small adjustment, the stream settled more firmly into place, widening just enough to carry itself across the land that had once resisted him, and when he finally stopped, leaning on the handle of the shovel, he looked out across the ranch and saw not what it had been, but what it could become, not in grand visions or sudden change, but in quiet growth, in steady return, in something earned rather than taken, and the wind moved through again, softer now, carrying the faint sound of water further than before, and Caleb closed his eyes for just a second, letting that sound settle deep, knowing that this was not the end of a hard life, not the beginning of an easy one, but something else entirely, something that would ask more of him than survival ever had, and as the light shifted toward evening, he stood there with the land around him and the water at his feet, understanding that the real story had only just begun. The light fell softer as evening stretched across the land, and Caleb stood where the water met the dust, watching the way the last gold of the sun settled into the thin stream as if it had always belonged there, and for the first time in years, the silence around him did not feel empty, it felt complete, like something long missing had finally returned without asking for permission, and he lifted the canteen again, turning it slowly in his hands, feeling the weight of it now filled, not just with water, but with memory, and he understood that it was not the metal that mattered, it was the moment it carried, the choice that had changed everything without asking for anything in return, and he walked along the stream, following its path as it curved gently across the land, each step measured, each breath steady, no longer chased by the sharp edge of thirst, but guided by something quieter, something deeper. And as he reached the far end where the water slowed and settled into the earth again, he paused, looking out across the open space that had once seemed so unforgiving, and he realized that nothing about it had truly changed. The land was still vast, still harsh, still demanding, but it no longer felt distant, it felt connected, as if it had been waiting for him to understand how to stand within it rather than against it, and the wind moved through once more, carrying the faint scent of damp soil now mixed with dust. A subtle shift that would have gone unnoticed before, but not anymore, not now, and Caleb lowered himself onto a weathered post, resting for a moment as the sky deepened, colors fading into long shadows that stretched across the ground like quiet reminders of the day that had passed, and he thought about the man who had stood before him, about the question that had been asked, not of his actions, but of his nature, and he realized that the answer had not been given in words, not fully, it had been given here, in what followed, in what remained, and he looked back toward the stream again, watching it move steadily, unhurried, and he understood that it would not stay if it was not respected, it would not grow if it was taken for granted, and that thought settled into him with a weight that felt different from burden, it felt like purpose, and in the distance, far beyond where the riders had disappeared, the horizon remained unchanged, wide and open, holding its silence without explanation. And Caleb did not expect them to return, did not expect anything more to arrive from that direction, because what had been given was already enough, more than enough, and he rose slowly, his body tired but steady, and walked back toward the house as the last light slipped away, leaving the land in a calm, cooling dusk, and just before he stepped inside,